turn that on and we'll get started here. Thanks again for coming. So I've got our Blackboard page pulled up and I've just shared my screen. We are in week 11 of the course, which is exciting because we are moving through. We're nearly done with week 11 and that has us with only 4 weeks left. So obviously this week is just our traditional discussion that y'all have had the chance to participate in, thinking about identity formation. This is kind of connected to some of the things that we've discussed previously in our course. So you'll notice some themes that keep coming up throughout, and that's intentional. It's because as we learn more, we can reflect differently on concepts that we might have considered previously with a little bit less of a perspective on theory and things like that. So we've got that discussion this week, and then next week we have another paper. So you'll notice week 13 is a discussion, week 14 is a quiz, and then week 15 is the final paper. So right now is a good time before we start talking about our topics for the day to pull up the week 12 paper. This paper is about addiction. And interestingly, several people, when I went through the topic proposals, had wanted to write and research about something related to addiction, whether it be alcoholism or drug abuse or a behavioral addiction of some sort. And I'm thrilled because this is a really important topic. So thank you to those of you who are diving into it. This is a paper that might help you to prepare if that is an area of focus for you in the week 15 paper, because we're talking about the biopsychosocial approach and addiction, thinking about the views that society has of addiction and addicts and how we can approach these situations, which are so complicated, using a biblical perspective and grace and truth. So it's the idea of addiction that it might be accepted in our society. I'll throw out an example right now. Most of us probably have a cell phone within 3 feet of us. If you don't, good job. But generally, we find ourselves on devices a lot more than we might realize or even feel good about. Some of us might have a screen time report that comes up on the cell phone, and it's always kind of astounding to see how many hours a day we quickly can spend on the phone between games and perhaps social media and text messages and internet browsing. And it's not that there's anything wrong with using a device, but sometimes we find that if we put it away or it's not working or we lose it, that we struggle a lot. So if a person has some of these compulsive or addictive tendencies with use of social media or devices such as a phone, to the point where it's hard to even drive somewhere without being on the cell phone, then we have to think about, is this an addiction that might be looked upon as acceptable in our society? And if so, why? And what's the difference between some that might be frowned upon in our society? So another one, I'm just throwing out some ideas as you approach this paper for next week. Another one is the concept of shopping addiction. So especially in today's point and click culture, they can be so easy to buy things automatically and receive them even more conveniently than ever. And in that situation, we don't have to wait in a line or go out and about. And especially with the closures with the coronavirus, that has become even more common for many people. So that's an example of a behavioral addiction when you're thinking about those that might be acceptable or less frowned upon in our society. Kind of interesting to consider. So that is our topic for week 12. Those who are here with us, any thoughts about other addictions that might be considered acceptable in our society that you might like to share in chat or out loud? And if you're not sure, that's okay. It's just kind of interesting to ponder.
Yeah, I can't really think of any right now other than the ones that you mentioned, but.
Yeah, that's okay. It's something to think about, right? It's all good. It's just, as you consider your own behaviors and the behaviors of people you observe, even alcohol and alcoholism is a popular topic in the field for medical components, as well as the psychological and the emotional components of that. But there is a lot of perpetuation of some unhealthy use of alcohol in our culture, and you'll notice it on social media, for instance, parenting and drinking. So the joke of, oh, mommy needs a drink, or, oh, this is mommy's grape juice, referring to wine. Some of these societal advertisements and messages that might seem like they're kind of funny or joking, but all of a sudden we recognize this is reinforcing the use of alcohol to relieve stress and to deal with frustrating situations, or situations where our tolerance or our patience might be low, and how quickly one can slide down this slippery slope. So even frequent or daily unhealthy use of alcohol and the happy hour concept can quickly go wrong. And that might be something that society considers more acceptable than use of another drug, for instance. Kind of interesting. So good luck. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, kind of bouncing off of that. I would say maybe like certain types of foods.
Ooh.
So unhealthy foods or sugary foods.
Yeah, good example. So sugar,
Just because it's
particular.
really stress.
Yes, Ellen, thanks for mentioning that. And I noticed that, as you mentioned, kind of piggybacking with that, caffeine. And I'm a person who enjoys coffee, so don't hear me criticizing. But lots of people who consume a lot of caffeine may come to the point where if they can't access it on a given day, they might experience physiological effects and maybe headaches or feeling short-tempered and not having any energy. And so the question that we can consider as we move into this is, where's the line? Is that an addiction? And why is nobody concerned about that? So we're really thinking about the concept of dependence. And there's a program you all might be familiar with. It's called Celebrate Recovery. And it's often housed within churches. It's basically a 12-step program, such as Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, or kind of some of those Al-Anon components, that is built and facilitated with the biblical perspective in mind. So it is working through the recovery process. Celebrate Recovery, or CR, it's often referred to as CR. And it does go through these 12 steps, which you may be familiar with, but it does that through the biblical perspective and with the message of salvation. So if one were to attend a CR meeting, you might experience worship, like music component before we get started. And then there's prayer and different speakers, and they do the same things as an Alcoholics Anonymous program. For instance, they hand out chips and things like that. So I actually will, just since we mentioned it, we're going to talk about trauma today, which is a really interesting topic. But since we're talking about CR, I will share that webpage real quickly here. So it is called a Christ-centered 12-step program. So you can see they've got conferences, exploring how can I find one of these meetings. And what I like about Celebrate Recovery, obviously, is the biblical perspective, but also CR is not necessarily geared towards a substance addiction. So CR addresses what they call hurts, habits, and hangups. This could be anything from interpersonal bitterness or anger and frustration with a family member, for instance. This could be food issues, like you said, Ellen, maybe eating disorder or some other unhealthy dependence. This could be related to drug or alcohol abuse, or this could be related to any kind of compulsion that a person is struggling with. And that's why they refer to hurts, habits, and hangups. So it doesn't have to be drugs or alcohol. I think many people can really benefit from attending one of these types of meetings, even if there's not a particular issue that they have in mind. So maybe as adults, if you get the chance to check it out, it's kind of interesting, and it just helps you to get familiar with the format of a 12-step process. And either it could be useful for you, or you could refer someone you know who's struggling and wants to move through the 12 with Christ as the focus. So kind of cool. That's the website. And now we will move into the trauma component. So my first question, and you can just give a thumbs up or pop it in the chat. Are you familiar with the ACEs study? Okay, well, I am glad we're talking about it, because this one is very interesting. Thanks, Ellen, for your response too. in my opinion. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And the ACEs study went on, this is through actually Kaiser Permanente. So you can see I'm on the Center for Disease Control website where they have a lot of summary information about ACEs. You can watch videos and things like that. But this is a study that began, Kaiser started this in 1995, and this exploration has been going on over time. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So what the ACEs study has, moved into is what are some of the most concerning, traumatic, or adverse events that can happen to a child? And then from there, what are the health outcomes? So this study does focus somewhat on mental health, but even more so, the study addresses physical health and the physiological outcomes that person might experience as a result of these traumatic events. So when we study psychology more and more today, and trauma is a hot topic in the field, we're learning and thinking about the mind-body connection and some of these physical manifestations of trauma. You might be familiar with a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. So this book, by the way, is not a Christian book, but it is very interesting with a lot of research about physiological manifestations of traumatic experiences and some of the health effects that can come from that. So The Body Keeps the Score is a nonfiction research-based book. It's quite thick, but I did get the chance to read all of it. And it's pretty interesting to explore if you're interested in that mind-body connection as we consider topics of trauma. However, for the ACEs study, it's kind of a more straightforward explanation than the book, The Body Keeps the Score. But this was a study where they looked at, it's two different waves of data. There were over 17,000 members, and this was in California. And it was the people in the HMO there who completed surveys regarding their childhood experiences, as well as their current health issues and behaviors. So what you might be able to guess is that the child abuse or neglect did lead to some serious health issues that a person might be more at risk for later in life. So there's a link. If you go to this, there it is, CDC page. This is a lengthy research study. I want to make sure you can see it. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Research Study, and I'm sharing. There you go. So you can see this is quite long. This is a 1998 article, and we're not going to obviously go through this whole thing, but I do have something that'll show the results more clearly. Down here in conclusions, you can see we found a strong graded relationship, a correlation between the breadth of exposure to abuse or household dysfunction during childhood and multiple risk factors for several leading causes of death in adults. So here we are looking at the medical side, and we could talk all day about why this connection exists. What's that about? And obviously, we don't have time to dive into every piece of it. But one thing we might consider, especially with this addiction research paper coming up, is that people who have experienced severe neglect, trauma, or abuse may be at greater risk for falling into addictive behaviors, not only because the substances, whether that be alcohol or drugs or both, may be abused in the home, but also because a person might be tempted to self-medicate to deal with PTSD symptoms or whatever psychological effects they may be experiencing as a result of these traumatic events, and kind of that desire to escape or to numb when those negative memories or emotions come up, or even if there are circumstances that are still persisting. So then if we do have drug or alcohol abuse, obviously those things can lead to some severe medical issues over time. But even outside of that, the ACEs study found that there is a much higher risk here for those who have experienced a significant number of traumatic events. So what we'll do, this is a little video, we're not going to watch it now, but if you want to just search for CDC ACEs study, you can find this. All sorts of links here, as you can see, and there's a lot of information about prevention, but I'm going to click on the fast facts. So These are some examples of ACEs that were considered in the study, and there are several, but obviously violence, abuse, or neglect would be relevant, and then witnessing violence in the home or in the community. So domestic abuse, for instance, between parents would be relevant as what's considered an ACE or an adverse childhood experience, and then having a family member attempt or die by suicide. So some of the statistics are down here. So about 61% of adults surveyed across 25 states have reported that they've experienced at least one type of ACE. And if you want to measure your ACEs, you can just Google the ACEs survey, and it'll give you about 1 page of questions. Have you experienced this or that? And some of them, of course, are intense and upsetting topics, but it is interesting to compare your experiences to some of these stats. So 61% of people in this survey mentioned here by the CDC. And preventing ACEs, it says up to 1.9 million cases of heart disease and 21 million cases of depression could be avoided by preventing ACEs. So obviously ACEs are costly, and that's part of what this website talks about, is without this preventative care, as these families are struggling and these children are impacted, they grow older, and there's an enormous tax and weight on the medical system and on themselves. And ultimately, we all suffer and struggle as a result of this. So the idea is that the results of this study emphasize even further the value of preventative care for families. And we'll talk about what prevention might look like, because oftentimes this feels like such a big problem that it seems impossible for us to cope with it or to do something as we're just one person. So here in What Are the Consequences? Talks about obviously food insecurity and the concept of toxic stress, and that long lasting chronic stress that a child can experience can change brain development. Ultimately, this could manifest in things like learning disabilities, problems with attention and impulse control. And lo and behold, those things can often relate to a struggle to graduate high school and proceed with a diploma and to become more marketable in the workforce. These can also lead to a higher likelihood of justice involvement, because if a person is struggling with an impulse control disorder and has all of this adrenaline and cortisol in the system, that leads us to a higher likelihood for committing crime. Also, if a child is neglected and doesn't have a community, that would lead to a higher likelihood for gang involvement. And obviously gang involvement would then be correlated or associated with a higher likelihood of criminal involvement too, and potential early death. So pretty interesting. As we scroll down, we can see options to strengthen families. So childcare programming for early childhood home visitation, really just teaching parenting skills and offering workshops and offering childcare so that people can attend those workshops and learn about anger management and learn about budgeting and learn about how to discipline effectively. Mentoring programs, after school programs, and really working through primary care facilities, healthcare, to develop these preventative measures and to screen for children who are impacted by domestic abuse or by a suicide in the family. Oftentimes children might see a doctor and the doctor's not even aware of what they're going through. So really training medical providers on these ACEs and the outcomes of them for not only physical health, but also for mental health, of course. So this is another little visual. This might make you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it's actually related to the ACEs study. So obviously in the bottom, we've got the context of trauma. And when these adverse experiences occur, the neurodevelopment, that brain development, is disrupted. And that's what we were just talking about, especially with continued toxic stress, which then can lead to these impairments, the risky behavior, and we fall into these issues that lead to early death, these social problems and medical problems that can lead to early death. So not to be discouraging, I know it is sad and difficult, but it's important to consider. They've got all the demographic information here. These are the ACEs I just mentioned. There are 3 different categories examined. So different types of abuse, household challenges, so mental illness in a parent, substance abuse, the separation of a parent, or these types of neglect. So all of these were considered adverse childhood experiences in the study. So they've got all of that information there if you are interested. And that is the gist of it. So before we conclude, I just want to know, does anybody have anything to share about the ACEs? What stands out to you? What do you think about these outcomes?
I think emphasizing the role of support is a good thing. Like, my church will sometimes do like a parenting group, or, you know, like giving people the tools that they need to improve their situations, and also making people aware. So
Absolutely. Yeah. So that preventative work. And I love that you mentioned what occurs in your church, because I believe churches have a really beautiful opportunity because they are within the community. Oftentimes they might be within walking distance of the home of some people who might need the help. And when churches can appeal through things like food banks and clothing drives, meeting those basic needs as we come back to Maslow's hierarchy can really help people to become more open to the message and say, you did this for me for free. You did this act of kindness. Why? And to better understand. And then by engaging in a church community, these skills and protective factors can be developed and can reduce the likelihood that more ACEs would occur. So thanks, Ellen. I love that you mentioned that. Jacob, anything you want to add or any reflections on this?
No, not really. Just, yeah, like what Ellen said, just the importance of spreading awareness of all of this. Yeah, other than that, not much to add.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thanks. I just want to make sure I don't talk at you guys the whole time. So we have just a couple minutes left. I do want to show you one more website. There's a ton of websites, obviously, but this is NCTSN, which stands for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And this is just if trauma is of interest to you, either for your own experiences or those of someone you know, or simply for research in the field in general. It's always good to be aware and informed. So if you scroll to trauma types, you can see there's a lengthy list here of different kinds of trauma. One that I will choose here, let's say disasters. So natural disasters, I'm going to click view. So obviously going through an extreme natural disaster is going to be traumatic. A child might lose the home, things like that. So then for each of these, you can see there are resources. Okay, so how about an earthquake? View, and it'll define the event. It'll talk about what can go on and what can be done for children before, during, and after the event. And it's just kind of a really good place to start to understand how you can help and support people who are struggling, whether that's in your current or future work, in your family, or with your friends, or even in your own experiences. So physical abuse, for instance, if we click on effects, this will give us information about what can come about for a child who is physically abused. And right next to it, as we just talked about, these proactive preventative measures would be interventions. So I click view, and here we have a couple different resources. This is a trauma-informed evidence-based treatment to help children to build stronger relationships with caregivers. So I'm clicking on a fact sheet. And oh, this is pretty cool. Yeah, you can see all sorts of stuff. So I actually just opened this one. I didn't look at this fact sheet yet. I clicked on it for the first time. And I like it. So it's a PDF that talks about this program, which is Alternatives for Families Cognitive Behavior Therapy. And it defines exactly what this is, who it's appropriate for, what do they do in this approach, and why. Where do they present information or research about it? How recent is it? And this can just be really fascinating to explore. So that's another website that you might find useful. And whether this has anything to do with your research for the final paper or not, I do think it's really relevant as we think about mental health, physical health, and psychological wellness and functioning in general. Okay, so with that, I will end the record.